Hello, I am Beyhan Karahan, a professor at the New York Institute of Technology, School of Architecture and Design. I've been teaching here since the mid-80s. Usually I teach studios and history theory courses. In this history and theory of urbanism and suburbanism class, we study the writings of seminal theoreticians and practitioners of urban design. The students select some early and some living practitioners like you and present their research to the class. Anyway, I'm delighted to have you answering our questions. Let me introduce you to the director of our program, Professor Marcella del Signore. Marcella is an associate professor, and she directs our Master of Science in Architecture, Urban and Regional Design program. Her work focuses on the intersection of architecture and urbanism with technology in public and cultural realm. She is the author of 5 books that engaged in public realm, socio-technological systems, urban prototyping, and data-driven protocols framed through the lens of interscholar design approaches. Anyway, here is Marcella.
Thank you, Professor Karahan, for the introduction, and welcome to the New York Institute of Technology, School of Architecture and Design. Thank you for joining us for the Conversations in Urban Design series. TILMAN LATZ is the partner and design director at Latz Partners, and he has been running the practice since 2011, after 10 years of partnership with Annelies and Peter Latz, and from 2016 together with his wife, Iris Dapper. He's a member of the Federation of German Landscape Architects and the Deutscher Werkbund Bayern. He's involved in the profession on the board of the BDLA Bayern and an international project group of the Bavarian chapter of architects. TILMAN LATZ studied landscape architecture at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, and at the University of Kassel, where he graduated in 1993. He went to study architecture at the Architectural Association in London, and then at the University of Kassel, where he completed his studies in 1997 with a diploma in architecture. From 1997 to 2001, he worked as a project manager for Gerda Architecture in Paris. In 2001 and 2003, he was a guest lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania, and from 2012 to 2014, guest professor at the University of Kassel. I will now introduce RUDRIKA from Jaipur, which is one of our graduate students in the MS.AURD program at NYIT, who will conduct the interview. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the introduction. And thank you so much, Tilman, for accepting our request for the interview. And good afternoon. So I'm going to start with the interview questions. My first question to you is, do you consider your work as part of an ideology about the world?
An ideology for me always is something which rules your work in a kind of, almost authoritarian way. But we might have some principles, but we are rather a group of people which works on a phenomenological basis, saying that each place is different, and we look at each place with new eyes, or with our eyes, but with new findings. So every place has a very specific character, very specific elements, and so on. And we try to do something with that first, before we do anything else. I mean, if you could say that there is a principle, then it's really like this search for the identity of a place. Because usually, it's not always the case, but usually there's always something you can find. And then secondly, of course, we have some addictions, let's take it that way, it's also something we're convinced of, that this is the right thing. But I would never say that this is an ideology. We're very pragmatic, and when you work with existing sites, or when you work with something which is there, then you have to be pragmatic. And we are convinced that this is a better way than to overrule it with some, yeah, let's say design ideas or functional ideas. And the principles are that we always try to, it's always, again, try to, because we have to make a selection. It's try to recycle in all directions. Recycle in like reusing things, recycle in like using an aggregate, transferring it into a different condition, or when we try to integrate things which you cannot see. We are very interested in the myths of a place, in the dreams of a place, in what people think, and not thinking about cliches. They're cliches of landscape, what all the people have, with its different cultural background, but really what they desire, what they need. And again, this is a more phenomenological approach also. So ideology, not really.
Okay. Thank you so much for the answer. My next question is, your immense reverence for the remarkable replenishment and conversion of industrialized landscape is known by all. So what drove you to this direction?
That's a good question. You can ask that to me. You can ask that to my father, because he did it 20 years before me, or 25 even. I think it was a slow process. I remember when I was still at school, my father started working on some former industrial sites, which had been completely demolished, and where the industry was replaced with new housing, new whatever, under the paradigms of the late 70s, early 80s. And which was very, very much driven by structuralism as a kind of approach of how to do architecture and urbanism, and which he tried to convert it into landscape architecture as well. I mean, my father always was very much in urbanism, but this kind of transfer of urbanistic and architectural rules and developing them further into something usable for landscape architecture was one of his goals, and I would say still is. As long as he lives, he will not stop working. But when I came, Duisburg was just finishing, and I had two projects basically which we could talk about. The first one was by chance. Postmodernism was coming up, and in postmodernism you looked at the old stuff and how to profit from that for architecture, and how things have been done before. And it's interesting that there was nothing about post-industrial sites. And my father immediately understood in these days, and that was, let's say late 70s, maybe, that he said, hey, we are just talking about the big pieces of architecture, everything what is known, but we're not talking about the unknown. It's like when you talk about vernacular architecture. And nobody talked about that in the big theories. And so he started to work on that with the students at university. And I visited him in these days. I was a young student when he was working on the harbor island in Saarbrücken. Mm-hmm. And he tried to, under a kind of, you could say a kind of postmodern vocabulary, he suddenly developed something new by applying these logics on landscape elements. And he tried to bring in the history of the whole country, of the Saar region. This is a western part of Germany, where there is a lot of former industrial architecture made with bricks, with concrete, and with steel. And he tried to transfer that into that landscape. And I think this was the kind of first step into a kind of research for a new language, a transfer into public space, and was the basis which later on then brought up the approach for Duisburg North. It's quite important to understand that, because it wasn't something like, yeah, you saw these things, you were fascinated. No, you started working on engineering elements, on things which are not usually a landscape, or haven't been a landscape thing. I mean, things have changed a lot since, and yeah, so that was basically the start. And it's also interesting that we continue to develop that approach further. I mean, since I'm working in there, we did some projects in China now, which I'm mainly responsible for. And that's why I insist, even industrial sites, some of them look quite similar. They are all different. And because industry is not something which you take and you put it here. Industry is only successful if you continuously develop it further. If not, you go bust. And that is something where we also, as a designer, have to start to continuously develop further. And so I'm doing that now with my team here. And the story continues.
You're giving us an in-depth knowledge of how the process works when you design. So thank you so much for that. My next question for you is, do you seek any inspiration from your own culture? If yes, till what extent does it reflect in your designs?
It's interesting. Everybody, whoever we talk to, is always, to a certain extent, a result of the cultures, I would say cultures, so it's plural, cultures he lives in. Mm-hmm. And I would say that even when you talk about Germany, Germany is a quite diverse country.
Right.
You have the south and the north, the west and the east, which are 4 different places, I would say, even. Mm-hmm. For example, our culture here in the south of Bavaria is much closer to Austria, but there's still many differences, of course. And if you talk to the north, it's much closer to Denmark, possibly, but also due to the fact that it's close to the ocean, has a different culture, and so on, as well as the west and the east. Also mentally, we're quite different. Mm-hmm. And I was growing up in the west in the beginning, then in the middle, before I moved to England and to Vienna, then went to Paris. And every place you go to is informing your personality. And we should be very aware about that. I mean, not only because it keeps us from becoming xenophobe, you know, as the mm-hmm. French say. I don't know the English translation of that. Xenophobe, it's, you know, when you have something against foreign people or right. people who are different. And I'm a mixture of that, you know. Also my father, you know, my father is from the west of Germany. He married an Austrian wife, a woman, sorry. And this brought many things together, but also the personality of people. So I wouldn't say it's rooted in a specific culture. And what is much more important is that we overcome the limits of that and are able to be as open as possible to new influences. Although sometimes we also have to reject influences, but I don't think we need to talk about that. Yeah, so it's a mixture of all of that. And within our work, very difficult to say, because, you know, the whole world says Germany is a country of engineers, which is, to a certain extent, it's true. It's true because we have all these engineers who are not only working in the car industry, but also in all these kind of high-tech industry. And Germany is, I think, the only country in Europe which has still a quite mixed economy, and engineers play a very vital role within that. Also electronics and all that kind of stuff. But that certainly plays a role because it influences, because we live in this, you know. I live in Munich, which is a car city, BMW. And I grew up in Kassel, which is Volkswagen city, has a huge thing over there, and building, unfortunately, also tanks. not Volkswagen, it's Thyssen, I think. However, this influences our way of working because you're in this flow and you start to argue like everybody argues. But my father and I, and also my mother, we've been always so international. This mixes up with many other things. But that could be something which helps us to develop an approach towards an engineered piece of, an engineered monster, a machine. I wouldn't say even architecture. The whole thing is one machine, which is sometimes covered with some nicely decorated buildings, but it's a machine. And in order to work with such a machine, maybe this kind of engineering thing comes to sight. That's possible. But I wouldn't insist on that. There's much more.
Thank you. My next question is about a project. The Ariel Sharon Park in the Tel Aviv is known to be one of the most ambitious reclamation projects. Can you tell us how you converted the Hiria landfill and several million cubic meters of flood water and transformed it into a flourishing oasis while trapping methane underneath and using to produce electricity? And what were the most challenging aspects of this project?
Tel Aviv. Yeah, I remember. I mean, this project came up when I was already in the office. And it started with a lot of ambition. It was only Hiria at the beginning. Ariel Sharon Park came a little bit later, only 2 years later. I think 2004 we started Hiria, and 2006 we won also the following on competition for the Ariel Sharon Park. And we never thought that it would take so long. It's really amazing. I mean, the problem of flooding in Tel Aviv is old, not super old. Most of it has come by sealing of surfaces within the Israeli country, simply because there's still so many people coming to that country, and there is still growth, I would say, of urbanized areas, which are very often only treated in a very superficial way, very effective, but superficial, in a sense that they have many sealed surfaces and all that water has to go somewhere. So they have quite big problems. And I saw the first pictures from a flooded street in Tel Aviv in 2002, when my father started to be invited as a kind of consultant to that process. Like many others, there were Americans, there were other Europeans, there was him. And most of them were invited also for the design competition for Hiria. And I saw these pictures and I couldn't believe it. For me, Israel was always a dry country where they work like mad, and certainly one of the best ones on irrigation systems. And suddenly I see that at a very special time in the year, they have so much water. And I always thought that would press the process and make that process real in, let's say, like maximum 10 years. And now we are in the 16th year or 14th year with Ariel Sharon Park, and it's still not done. I mean, parts of the project are produced. They have done the huge Wadi, which you might have seen, which takes some of the water, but I would say 50 to 60% of the projects are still missing. It's similar with the Hiria mountain. We have done the oasis, we have done the plateau, we have done some of the work of the major orientation, but the foot terrace is there, but it's not yet built, you know, what we propose. They want to do it, they will do it. I even believe them, although there's not much done, but everything takes so much time. So when you come to Israel, it's biblical. And that is the biggest problem, I would say. There's other challenges really, due to how the Israeli society is constructed. Every time there is a military conflict, there's nobody on the work site anymore because they are all soldiers. Every Israeli is a soldier, men and women. And so basically every time there is a problem or a crisis, especially with the neighbors, and they have some of them every year, almost something is happening. They leave all the work where it is and have to go to the army, or at least stay at home to be ready. And this is certainly a big issue, although on the other side, once you work, it's really running like this, because they have this mentality, they have this organizational logic, but this was sometimes for us, we had to learn it. It was not easy. Besides, Israel is a highly developed country, and you can do almost everything, and everybody, almost all people are highly skilled. It's really great. And whoever you meet, there's rarely a person who's not really skilled to talk with you about such issues. But it is very much combined with this, with a country which had been developing that country really for the first time. I mean, before the Israelis came there was already a high culture, of course, but it was never this intensity of agriculture and industry, what they have. And they did that in these 50, 60 years. It's amazing. And finally, there is one more thing, which is positive and negative. It's a small country. I mean, there's many people living there, but a small country means that you have a very direct contact from everything what happens in the country with the actual politics, which is a positive thing on one side, because it means, yeah, when somebody talks to somebody, then something runs faster. On the other hand, it's a problem, because this, how can I say that? Some processes become not very understandable for German logic. I wouldn't say that is Mediterranean. I think it is very specific Israeli. I did say always it's Mediterranean, but it's not. It's not like Italy or the North African countries or so. It's very, very specific. And what is great, I mean, I always thought that with all these rules they have with their religion, that would be a problem, but that was never an issue. I mean, some things are strange for me coming from Central Europe, but that's not anything which could hinder making great projects. It's a great country. It's really amazing. It's crazy, yeah.
Thank you so much for the insights of this project. My next question to you is, based on our research, your incredible designs address some very important issues like energy efficiency. Do you have any recent projects that address the issue of rising waters due to the climate change?
Rising water. Yeah, almost any project over here has to have it. When you work in, I mean, in Israel, it was interesting because the 7 million cubic meters was something which was decided by the scientific boards of Israel and people who had calculated it, and we had to take it. And yeah, we did it in a way which was mostly highlighted by the jury, fortunately. Here in Central Europe, it's a must. Every project you're doing has to integrate a strategy towards retaining water. There's very clear rules in almost every Central European country. I think now even in every country in Europe, that you have to be equipped to retain even the 100 years flooding water. So when something like this has to happen, you have to have a ditch somewhere, or a cistern or whatever to retain that water. And if not, have to do other precautions. We have a green roof strategy in Europe, except in historic cities, and all this is on the one hand great, because you really have a good response towards some of the issues, at least we have to face at the moment. On the other hand, it's a bit of a problem because that doesn't allow for a lot of innovation. That's always the problem, you know. We find out a big problem, we ask for rules to deal with that. And once we have the rules, we're not happy anymore because it kills creativity. It's always like this, you know. And we try to escape from that sometimes. And within our latest projects, this always plays a role. It's sometimes very difficult because the numbers are still changing. You know, when 10 years ago, 100 years flawed was that much, today 100 years flawed is that much. And the rules are constantly changing. So when you do a project, maybe just before you hand it in, there's a new rule and you have to change everything. That happens. It's not as catastrophic as I say, but it's quite an issue. And our latest projects have that all inscribed, except in a kind of existing context, especially urban context. And that is simply because, so for example, we did that park in Berlin, and there was no demand whatsoever to retain water. And that is quite easy to understand because the whole system is already not of whole Berlin, but most of Berlin has a system on how to retain the water. And most is done with underground system. So why should you now change it? It functions quite well even. Whereas over here, that changes still a lot. So almost every project has it. I mean, the bigger projects, yeah, there's a little bit, but it's not really worth talking about it because we are applying the rules the authorities have basically installed. And when we work in foreign countries, it's usually done with huge retention basins, not underground, overground. So we did a project, for example, in Freiburg, which is the southwestern corner of Germany, a very nice corner with the best weather you can imagine. A lot of sun, enough rain, everything is perfect over there. But they have the same problem. And we won a competition together with K9 architects for that new quarter for 15,000 people and worked on the master plan. And we foresaw 2 parks within that. And one park was more for playing and sports and for the people and neighborhood gardens. And the other one was a kind of nature, not reserve. It was something where we said, yeah, it should be more wild and kids can still play there.
Right.
They found out that there is so much water coming from above and from our new quarter that they needed a basin for, how much was that? 500,000 cubic meters, something like this, of water, which is a lot. Freiburg is a small town. You know, it has, I think, 100,000 inhabitants altogether, student town. But it was mainly to the water which came down from the city. So this park had to become a retention basin. And the fight was hard. I mean, there's very nice projects on such retention basins, but the rules are really tough. And we were working for that for half a year in order to make this retention basin something which can also be a park. But the restrictions are really tough because a retention basin says hardly any trees, no obstacles, which keeps the water from floating easily down, and so on and so on and so on. The barriers are massive, and it is, in the end, it is an area which is constantly cut into pieces. And whatever you do, engineering wins. But it has become a nice park now. It's not yet built, but will be built, hopefully. And so we're applying the rules.
I just want to say a heartfelt thank you for this amazing interview and your incredible answers. Thank you so much.